Welcome to Story Planet, where every tale is a journey. Tonight, we invite you to settle in with the Rainy Mosswood Inn, a story set in the soothing world of Mosswood Inn. As the gentle rain falls, let yourself unwind and drift into the peaceful atmosphere of this cozy retreat. To make you feel even closer to the story, the sound of rain will accompany you throughout, enhancing the experience. And if you happen to enjoy the story, don't wait until the end. You might just drift off to sleep before the novel finishes. You may consider liking the video now, while you're still awake. The Rainy Mosswood Inn. The rain began in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun had risen, and it showed no sign of stopping. By the time Eleanor's car pulled into the winding gravel driveway of Mosswood Inn, the rain was pouring down in steady sheets, tapping on the roof of the car, like a gentle reminder that the outside world was being washed clean. The surrounding forest, thick with tall evergreens and low moss-covered oaks, seemed to absorb the sound, creating an intimate cocoon of mist and rain around the property. Eleanor had been coming to Mosswood every autumn for nearly 5 years now. It had started as a simple weekend getaway, a break from her stressful job in the city, but it had quickly become something more. A ritual of sorts. There was something about the quiet solitude of the inn, the smell of the rain-soaked earth, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere that made her feel as though she could breathe deeply for the first time in months. The inn itself was an old stone manor, nestled at the edge of a small lake that was often shrouded in mist. Its ivy-covered walls and large, paned windows gave it a timeless charm, as though it had been sitting there watching over the land for centuries. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge, were kind and unassuming, running the inn with a quiet efficiency that made every guest feel like they were staying in a well-loved home. Eleanor parked her car near the front entrance, grabbed her umbrella from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the rain. The cool air hit her face, and she inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh scent of wet pine and damp earth. The rain pattered softly on her umbrella as she walked up the steps to the front porch, where a pair of old rocking chairs sat under the shelter of the eaves, waiting for someone to settle into them with a book or a cup of tea. She knocked gently on the heavy wooden door, and after a few moments, it swung open to reveal Mrs. Aldridge's warm smile. The elderly woman was dressed in a thick cardigan, her silver hair pinned back in a neat bun. She greeted Eleanor as though she had been expecting her all along, her eyes twinkling with that familiar, grandmotherly warmth. "Eleanor, my dear, welcome back," Mrs. Aldridge said, pulling her into a soft embrace. "You must be soaked through. Come in, come in." Eleanor stepped inside, grateful to be out of the rain. The warmth of the inn enveloped her immediately, and she could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The foyer was just as she remembered: stone floors, dark wood paneling, and the faint scent of wood smoke from the fire that always seemed to be burning in the sitting room. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge," Eleanor said, shaking off her umbrella and handing it to the older woman. "It's good to be back." Mrs. Aldridge smiled knowingly. "We always say that autumn isn't truly here until you arrive." Eleanor chuckled softly, feeling a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Mosswood was her haven, her retreat from the chaos of the outside world. She followed Mrs. Aldridge through the foyer and into the sitting room, where a fire crackled merrily in the large stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was filled with comfortable armchairs and plush sofas, all arranged around low wooden tables that held stacks of books and board games. Large windows looked out over the lake, though today the view was obscured by the rain and mist. "I've put you in your usual room," Mrs. Aldridge said, handing Eleanor the old-fashioned key to her room. "I've made sure there's plenty of firewood, and there's hot cocoa waiting for you in the kitchen if you like." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "That sounds perfect. Thank you." Aldridge nodded and made her way back to the front desk, leaving Eleanor alone in the sitting room. For a moment, Eleanor simply stood there, letting the warmth of the fire and the soft crackling of the logs soothe her. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a gentle background hum that seemed to lull the entire inn into a state of peaceful calm. After a few moments, Eleanor made her way up the grand staircase to her room. The familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet was oddly comforting. And when she reached the landing, she paused for a moment to look out one of the large windows. The view from here was one of her favorites. The misty lake surrounded by trees, their leaves just starting to turn golden with the onset of autumn. Her room was just as she remembered, cozy and inviting, with a large four-poster bed draped in soft quilts and a small fireplace in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, and a comfortable armchair sat by the window, offering a perfect spot to sit and read while listening to the rain. Eleanor set her suitcase down by the bed and crossed the room to the window, opening it just slightly to let in the cool, fresh air. The sound of the rain was clearer now, a gentle rhythm that filled the room with its steady, soothing presence. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt herself truly relax. She had been working non-stop in the city, her days filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant hum of activity that never seemed to slow down. But here at Mosswood, time seemed to move at its own pace, and the outside world felt distant and unimportant. She changed into a pair of comfortable pajamas, lit the fire in the small fireplace, and curled up in the armchair by the window with a book. The rain continued to fall outside, a soft and steady soundtrack to her peaceful evening. As she sipped her hot cocoa, Eleanor felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. Mosswood was more than just a place. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape from the noise and chaos of her life and find a quiet, comforting peace. And as the rain continued to fall, she knew that this weekend would be just what she needed to recharge and reconnect with herself. The fire crackled softly, and the rain drummed gently against the window. The book in Eleanor's lap was forgotten as she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the soothing sound of the rain lull her into a light, peaceful doze. Eleanor awoke to the sound of voices downstairs, muffled but cheerful, as if the inn had filled with life while she dozed. She stretched in her chair, the fire now burning low, and glanced out the window. The rain had eased somewhat, but the mist still clung to the lake and trees, casting the world outside in a soft, otherworldly glow. Curious, she rose from her chair and made her way downstairs, following the sound of conversation to the sitting room. There by the fire she found several other guests gathered, their faces lit by the flickering flames and the warm glow of the lamplight. Mr. Aldridge, the innkeeper, stood by the fire, talking animatedly with a tall man in a raincoat, while a woman with dark, curly hair sat nearby, flipping through a book. Two older women, clearly sisters by the look of them, were sitting on a sofa near the window, knitting and chatting quietly. Eleanor smiled to herself as she entered the room, feeling the welcoming atmosphere wrap around her like a blanket. Mosswood had always attracted an interesting mix of guests: travelers, artists, writers, and those simply seeking a quiet escape from their busy lives. The inn had a way of drawing people together, of creating a sense of community, even among strangers. Eleanor lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching the others before quietly making her way to an empty armchair near the fire. Mr. Aldridge caught her eye and gave her a welcoming smile, motioning for her to join the conversation. "Ah, Eleanor, just in time," he said warmly. "We were just talking about the rain. Seems like it's here to stay for a few days." Eleanor smiled and nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The tall man in the raincoat turned to Eleanor and offered a friendly nod. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending a hand. "Here for the rain too?" Eleanor shook his hand. "Something like that. I come here every year around this time. There's something about this place during a rainy autumn that I can't resist." Daniel smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I can see why. It's my first time here, but I already feel like I've stepped into another world." The woman with the curly hair, who had been quietly reading her book, looked up and smiled at Eleanor. "I'm Lila," she said softly. "I've been coming here for years too. There's nowhere quite like Mosswood." Eleanor returned her smile, feeling an immediate connection with the group. The room was filled with the kind of warmth that only came from shared moments, whether with old friends or new acquaintances. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the rain continued its gentle tap on the windows, creating a backdrop of soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to invite deeper conversation. The two elderly sisters, who had been quietly knitting by the window, glanced up at Eleanor as well. One of them, with her hair tied in a neat bun, introduced herself. "I'm Margaret," she said, her voice steady and kind. "And this is my sister Joan. We've been coming here since we were little girls." Joan smiled warmly. "Our parents used to bring us here. It was a different kind of place back then, but the rain has always been the same." Eleanor was struck by the timelessness of the place, as though Mosswood existed outside of the regular flow of time. It was a place where the past and present seemed to blur, where stories from years ago could sit comfortably alongside the moments unfolding now. As they settled into conversation, the topic naturally drifted to the rain. There was something about the weather that seemed to evoke memories, reflections, and stories from everyone. Lila, who had been sitting quietly with her book, spoke up first. "The rain always reminds me of my grandmother's house. She lived in the countryside, in a little cottage surrounded by fields. Whenever it rained, we'd sit by the window and watch the drops dance on the glass. She'd make tea, and we'd listen to the rain as if it was a song just for us." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Rain has a way of slowing everything down, doesn't it?" I think that's what I love about it. It gives you permission to stop rushing and just be present. Eleanor found herself agreeing. That's why I come here. The rain makes everything feel quieter. It's like the world becomes softer and all the noise from outside fades away. Margaret, who had been knitting steadily, looked up with a twinkle in her eye. You know, the rain has been a part of Mosswood's charm for as long as I can remember. I think it's why people keep coming back. There's something about the sound of it, the way it fills the air without being intrusive. It's like an old friend. Joe nodded in agreement. And this old house, with its thick stone walls, was made for rainy days. It wraps you up, keeps you safe from the storm outside. There's something comforting about that. The conversation flowed easily from one topic to the next, with each person sharing bits of their own story, their own connection to the rain and to Mosswood. Daniel talked about his work as a photographer, how he had spent years chasing storms and capturing the beauty of the natural world. Lila shared her love for old books and how she had discovered Mosswood while searching for a quiet place to finish writing her latest novel. As the night wore on, the group settled into a comfortable rhythm. They laughed, told stories, and listened to the rain, which had become a steady downpour outside. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting a soft glow over the room, and the sound of the rain on the roof seemed to lull everyone into a peaceful, reflective state. Eventually, the conversation began to wind down. One by one, the guests said their goodnights and made their way to their rooms. Eleanor lingered by the fire for a few moments longer, enjoying the quiet. The rain was a steady, calming presence, and she could feel the weight of her thoughts lifting as the peaceful atmosphere of Mosswood worked its magic. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the gentle sound of rain pattering against the window. She stretched beneath the soft covers, feeling the warmth of the room contrast with the cool, damp air outside. It was still early, the world outside barely touched by the first light of dawn, and she knew she had a few more hours of quiet before the inn began to stir with the activity of its guests. She rose slowly, pulling on a thick wool sweater before padding barefoot to the window. Outside, the mist still clung to the lake and the surrounding trees, giving the landscape a dreamlike quality. The rain was lighter now, a steady drizzle that painted the world in shades of silver and green. Eleanor opened the window just slightly, letting in the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth and pine. The cool air was invigorating, and she breathed deeply, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. There was something about rainy mornings at Mosswood that felt almost sacred, as though time itself had slowed down to allow for quiet reflection. She made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Aldridge was already bustling about, preparing breakfast for the guests. The scent of freshly baked bread and coffee filled the air, and Eleanor's stomach rumbled in anticipation. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Aldridge greeted her with a smile. "I hope you slept well?" "I did," Eleanor said, returning the smile. "The rain always makes for good sleeping weather." Mrs. Aldridge chuckled. "That it does. I always say Mosswood was made for rainy days. It just wouldn't be the same without them." Eleanor nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. She poured herself a cup of coffee and made her way to the large bay window that overlooked the lake. The view was breathtaking, even with the rain and mist obscuring the distant trees. There was a quiet beauty to the landscape, a sense of stillness that was rare in the city. As she sipped her coffee, Eleanor thought about the conversations from the night before. Each of the guests had come to Mosswood for different reasons, but they all seemed to share a common thread: a desire for peace, for quiet, for a break from the relentless pace of the world outside. The rain had a way of bringing those feelings to the surface, of reminding them all to slow down and appreciate the small moments of stillness. After breakfast, the rain had lightened to a soft drizzle, and Eleanor decided to take a walk around the grounds. Mosswood Inn was surrounded by acres of forest and meadows, with winding paths that led down to the lake and beyond. It was one of her favorite things to do when she stayed here. Walk in the rain, with nothing but the sound of her footsteps and the soft rustling of the trees for company. She pulled on her raincoat and boots and stepped outside, the cool air immediately refreshing against her skin. The world was still and quiet, save for the gentle patter of rain on the leaves. The path she followed was soft and mossy, winding its way through the trees and down toward the water. As she walked, Eleanor let her mind wander. There was something about being in nature, especially in the rain, that made it easier to think. The noise and distractions of the world seemed to melt away, leaving only the simplicity of the moment. The trees around her were tall and majestic, their branches heavy with moisture, and the ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the air, and she breathed it in deeply, feeling the stress of her everyday life slip away. When she reached the lake, she paused, taking in the view. The water was smooth and glassy, reflecting the mist and rain in soft, muted tones. It was a scene of perfect stillness, as though the world had been paused in this moment of quiet beauty. Eleanor found a large rock near the water's edge and sat down, watching the rain ripple gently across the surface of the lake. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. As Eleanor sat by the lake, lost in thought, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see a man walking toward her, his raincoat pulled tight against the drizzle. It was Daniel, the photographer she had met the night before. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice quiet in the misty morning air. "Not at all," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the rock beside her. Daniel sat down, his gaze focused on the lake. For a few moments they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain and watching the gentle ripples on the water. "I didn't expect it to be this beautiful," Daniel said softly. "I mean, I knew it would be peaceful, but it's something else." Eleanor smiled. "That's why I keep coming back. There's something about Mosswood that just feels right, especially in the rain." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape. "It's like the world is holding its breath." They sat together for a while longer, the rain falling softly around them. There was no need for words. The quiet beauty of the moment was enough. The rain had picked up again by the time Eleanor and Daniel made their way back to the inn. Thick drops fell from the eaves of the manor, and the steady drizzle had transformed into a misty downpour. Inside, the warmth of Mosswood was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The fire in the sitting room had been stoked, burning brightly, and the guests had begun to gather again in the cozy space. Margaret and Joan were still knitting by the window, their quiet chatter adding a soothing background hum to the room. Lila had returned to her favorite armchair, a blanket draped over her lap and her book open, though she seemed more interested in watching the rain than reading. Mr. Aldridge, ever the gracious host, was serving tea and coffee to the guests, offering warm drinks to anyone who wanted them. Eleanor took a cup of chamomile tea, the steam rising gently as she breathed in its calming scent. She settled into a chair near the fire, feeling the weight of the day's walk easing from her shoulders. Daniel sat across from her, holding his own cup of tea, his camera bag resting at his feet. The atmosphere in the room was one of quiet contentment, as though the rain outside had brought everyone closer, creating a shared sense of peaceful retreat. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation among the guests began to flow more freely. It started with small talk, comments about the weather, questions about travel plans, but soon the conversation turned to more personal stories. There was something about the rain, the crackling fire, and the soft glow of the room that invited reflection and connection. Lila, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon, spoke up first. "I've always loved rainy days," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I think it's because they remind me of the time I spent with my grandmother. She used to tell me stories whenever it rained, beautiful, magical stories about faraway places and people I'd never met. I think that's why I became a writer." Eleanor smiled, nodding in understanding. "I think rainy days have a way of making everything feel more intimate, like the world is smaller and you can focus on the things that really matter." Margaret looked up from her knitting, her eyes twinkling. "My sister and I used to play a game when we were young. Whenever it rained, we'd make up stories. Tales of brave adventurers, lost kingdoms, and hidden treasures. I suppose we never quite grew out of it." Joan chuckled. "We didn't, did we? Even now when it rains, I feel that old spark of imagination coming back." The room seemed to hum with a quiet energy as the guests shared their memories and stories. It was as though the rain outside had opened a door to the past, allowing them to reconnect with moments that had shaped their lives. Daniel, who had been listening intently, set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. "I've always found that the best photographs are taken in the rain," he said thoughtfully. "There's something about the way the light changes, how the world looks softer, more ethereal. It's like the rain reveals something hidden beneath the surface." Eleanor, intrigued, looked at him with interest. "Do you have any photographs from your travels?" Daniel smiled and reached for his camera bag, pulling out a small album. "I do, actually. These are from a trip I took to the Pacific Northwest last year. It rained almost every day, but it made for some incredible shots." He handed the album to Eleanor, who carefully opened it. The photographs were stunning. Landscapes bathed in mist, towering trees draped in rain, and rivers swollen with water. There was a quiet beauty to each image, a sense of solitude and reflection that mirrored the mood of the afternoon. As Eleanor flipped through the album, she found herself drawn into the world Daniel had captured. The rain in his photographs wasn't something to be avoided or endured. It was an integral part of the scene, adding depth and mystery to the landscapes. "These are beautiful," she said softly. "There's a sense of stillness in them, like the world has paused for just a moment." Daniel nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "That's what I love about rain. It forces you to slow down, to really see what's around you." The group continued to share stories and memories well into the evening, their voices blending with the sound of the rain outside. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting warm light over the room, and the rain continued to fall, steady and soothing. The next morning dawned much the same as the one before, with a gentle mist clinging to the trees and a steady drizzle pattering against the windows. Eleanor awoke feeling rested and content, the peace of Mosswood settling over her like a blanket. After a leisurely breakfast, she decided to explore the inn a bit more. Mosswood was a large manor, with winding hallways and hidden nooks that invited exploration. Though she had stayed here many times before, there were always new corners to discover, and she loved the feeling of getting lost in the quiet, timeless spaces of the old house. As she wandered through the hallways, Eleanor found herself drawn to a small room at the back of the inn. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open, revealing a cozy study. The room was filled with bookshelves, their wooden frames dark with age, and a large desk sat by the window overlooking the lake. Curious, Eleanor stepped inside. The air in the room was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. She walked over to the desk, running her fingers over its smooth surface, and noticed a stack of letters sitting in one of the drawers, tied together with a faded ribbon. She hesitated for a moment before gently lifting the letters from the drawer. They were old, the paper yellowed with age, and the ink slightly smudged in places. The top letter was addressed to someone named Elizabeth, and the date on it was nearly 50 years old. Intrigued, Eleanor unfolded the letter and began to read. It was written in a neat, elegant script, and as she read, she realized that it was a love letter, beautiful and heartfelt. The writer spoke of longing, of distance, and of the hope that they would be reunited one day. There was something deeply personal about the letter, something that resonated with Eleanor as she read it. She wondered who Elizabeth was and whether she had ever received the letter. Had she replied? Had the two lovers ever found each other again? The letter seemed to hold a piece of history, a story that had been forgotten but not lost. Eleanor carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer, her mind swirling with thoughts. There was something about Mosswood that seemed to hold stories within its walls, stories of love, of loss, of quiet moments in the rain. As she left the study and made her way back to the sitting room, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that the inn itself was alive with history, its walls whispering the stories of the people who had passed through its doors over the years. The rain had eased to a light drizzle by the time Eleanor stepped outside. She pulled her coat tighter around her and set off down one of the winding paths that led away from the inn. The forest surrounding Mosswood was lush and green, the trees heavy with moisture, and the ground beneath her feet was soft and mossy. The quiet was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Eleanor loved walking in the rain. It was one of the reasons she had chosen to come to Mosswood in the autumn. There was something about the solitude of the forest in the rain that allowed her to clear her mind, to think more deeply about the things that mattered. As she walked, she thought about the letter she had found, about the love that had been expressed so beautifully in words. She wondered if she would ever experience that kind of love, the kind that transcended time and distance, that lingered in the air like the scent of rain. The path led her down to the edge of the lake, where the mist was still thick and the water rippled gently in the breeze. She found a large rock to sit on and stared out at the water, letting the peace of the moment settle over her. Eleanor had always been someone who valued solitude. She was comfortable in her own company, content to spend time alone in quiet reflection. But there was something about the letter, something about the words written with such care, that made her long for connection, for someone to share these quiet moments with. The rain began to pick up again, and Eleanor pulled the hood of her coat over her head. She stayed by the lake for a while longer, watching the rain ripple across the surface of the water, before finally heading back to the inn. When Eleanor returned to the inn, she found the sitting room buzzing with activity. Several new guests had arrived, and the room was filled with the sound of conversation and laughter. Daniel was sitting by the fire, deep in conversation with a new arrival, a woman with long, dark hair and a bright smile. Eleanor made her way over to them, curious to meet the new guest. The woman introduced herself as Clara, a traveler who had been making her way across the country for the past several months. "I've always wanted to visit Mosswood," Clara said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I've heard so many stories about this place. It's like a hidden gem, tucked away from the rest of the world." Eleanor smiled, understanding exactly what Clara meant. "It really is. There's something magical about it, especially when it rains." Clara nodded eagerly. "That's what I've heard. I'm hoping to stay here for a while, maybe write a bit, take some time to reflect. There's something about the rain that makes me feel more creative." The conversation flowed easily, and soon the three of them were sharing stories about their travels, their experiences, and their dreams. Clara spoke of the places she had been, the people she had met along the way, and the lessons she had learned from a life spent on the road. "There's something freeing about traveling," Clara said thoughtfully. "It forces you to let go of everything you thought you needed and focus on the present moment. When you're constantly moving, you learn to appreciate the little things, the sound of rain, the warmth of a fire, the kindness of strangers." Eleanor found herself nodding in agreement. She had always loved the idea of travel, of experiencing new places and meeting new people. But there was also something comforting about having a place like Mosswood to return to, a place where she could slow down, reflect, and reconnect with herself. As dusk began to settle over Mosswood, the inn grew even cozier. The rain outside had picked up again, drumming softly against the windows and creating a soothing, rhythmic sound. The guests had gathered in the sitting room after dinner, the fire and the hearth blazing brightly and casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. It was Clara who suggested music. She had found an old piano in one of the side rooms, its wooden frame polished by years of use, and her eyes had lit up with excitement. "Does anyone play?" she had asked, her voice full of eager curiosity. "I've always thought rainy evenings were perfect for a bit of music." Eleanor had hesitated at first. She had taken piano lessons as a child, but hadn't played in years. Yet something about the relaxed atmosphere of the inn, the camaraderie that had grown between the guests, made her feel brave enough to give it a try. "I can play a little," she admitted, smiling shyly. Clara grinned. "Perfect. Let's see what you've got." Eleanor sat down at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before she began to play a simple, familiar tune. The notes were soft and tentative at first, but as she relaxed into the music, the melody grew richer, filling the room with its gentle sound. The other guests listened quietly, their faces lit by the soft glow of the fire. There was something about music that had a way of drawing people together, of creating a shared moment that transcended words. As Eleanor played, she felt a sense of connection with the others, as though the music was weaving them all into the same story. When she finished the piece, there was a soft ripple of applause from the group. Clara, who had been sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fire, looked up at her with a smile. "You're really good," she said. "You should play more often." Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thanks," she said, feeling a bit shy but also proud. It had been a long time since she had played for anyone, and it felt good to share something so personal with this group of people who had quickly become more than just strangers. Margaret and Joan, still sitting with their knitting near the window, exchanged a glance before Margaret spoke up. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I used to play the piano when I was young. Our parents insisted on lessons, though I never took to it quite the way Joan did." Joan chuckled softly. "That's because you were always more interested in running outside and getting into trouble." Margaret grinned. Guilty as charged. Clara's eyes sparkled with interest. "Why don't you give it a try, Margaret?" The older woman waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, it's been far too long. I doubt I even remember how." But Joan nudged her gently. "Oh, come on, Margaret. You've always had a knack for it, even if you don't admit it." With a reluctant smile, Margaret rose from her seat and made her way to the piano. She sat down and took a deep breath, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment before she began to play. The notes were soft and a little unsteady at first, but as the melody took shape, it was clear that the years hadn't dulled her talent. The room filled with the rich sound of the piano, and everyone listened in quiet appreciation. It was a simple, beautiful moment, one that felt timeless, as though it could have taken place at any point in Mosswood's long history. When Margaret finished, the room was quiet for a few heartbeats before breaking into warm applause. She laughed softly, a little embarrassed but clearly pleased. "Not bad for an old lady, huh?" she said with a grin. Joan beamed at her. "You've still got it, Margaret." The music set the tone for the rest of the evening. The group fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, storytelling, and laughter, their voices blending with the sound of the rain outside. The fire crackled warmly, and the cozy atmosphere made it feel as though time had slowed down, allowing them to savor every moment. The next morning dawned gray and misty, with the rain still falling steadily. Eleanor woke early, drawn by the quiet peace of the inn in the early hours. She dressed and made her way downstairs, where she found Mrs. Aldridge in the kitchen, already busy preparing breakfast for the guests. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Aldridge greeted her with a warm smile. "Up early, I see." Eleanor smiled in return. "I couldn't resist. There's something about mornings here that feels so peaceful." Mrs. Aldridge nodded, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "Mosswood has that effect on people. It's the quiet, I think, and the rain, of course." Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching Mrs. Aldridge work. The innkeeper moved with an easy grace, her hands deftly chopping vegetables for what looked like a hearty breakfast spread. "Mrs. Aldridge," Eleanor began, her curiosity piqued by the letters she had found the day before. "I was exploring the inn yesterday and came across an old letter in the study. It seemed very personal, like it had been forgotten there for a long time." Mrs. Aldridge paused in her work, her eyes softening with a hint of nostalgia. "Ah, you found one of the letters, did you? Those have been in the inn for as long as I can remember. They belonged to the original owners, Elizabeth and James." Eleanor's curiosity deepened. "Who were they?" Mrs. Aldridge smiled gently. "Elizabeth and James were the couple who built this inn nearly 100 years ago. They were deeply in love, but life wasn't easy for them. James was often away, traveling for work, and Elizabeth stayed here, running the inn and waiting for his return. They wrote letters to each other constantly. Beautiful, heartfelt letters that spoke of their love and longing." Eleanor's heart ached at the thought of such a love, so filled with longing and hope. Did they ever find happiness together? Mrs. Aldridge's expression grew wistful. "In a way, yes. James eventually returned, and they spent their remaining years here together. But life had taken its toll on them. They had lived through years of separation, and though their love never wavered, there was a sadness to their reunion. They had lost so much time." The story stirred something deep within Eleanor. There was something timeless about love letters, about the way they could capture a moment, a feeling that transcended the passage of time. "Are the letters still here?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft with wonder. Mrs. Aldridge nodded. "Many of them, yes. We keep them as a reminder of the love that built this inn. It's why Mosswood has such a special feeling to it. There's a history here, a legacy of love and hope." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. There was something deeply moving about the idea of love enduring through time, even when life had been difficult. She could feel the weight of that love in the air at Mosswood, as though the walls themselves remembered the letters, the hopes, and the dreams that had once filled this place. Later that afternoon, the rain had eased into a light mist, and Eleanor decided to take another walk. She made her way down the familiar path that led to the lake, the ground soft and damp beneath her feet. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and pine. As she walked, Eleanor's mind wandered back to the story of Elizabeth and James. She couldn't stop thinking about the letters, about the love they had shared, even in the face of separation and loss. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about their story, a love that had endured despite the passage of time. Eleanor reached the edge of the lake and found her favorite spot, a large flat rock that jutted out over the water. She sat down, gazing out at the mist-covered lake, and let her thoughts drift. The rain was soft and steady, creating gentle ripples on the surface of the lake. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of quiet that allowed for deep reflection. As Eleanor sat there, she realized that Mosswood had become more than just a retreat for her. It had become a place of healing, a place where she could reconnect with herself and with the things that truly mattered. She thought about her life back in the city, about the constant noise and busyness that had consumed her for so long. Here, in the quiet of Mosswood, she could finally hear her own thoughts again. She could feel the weight of her worries lifting, replaced by a sense of peace that came from being surrounded by nature and history. As she sat by the lake, the sound of the rain lulling her into a meditative state, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself. She would take this feeling of peace and carry it with her, even when she returned to the city. She would hold on to the quiet moments, the stillness, and the sense of connection she had found here at Mosswood. And as she watched the rain fall softly on the lake, she knew that she would return to this place again and again, because Mosswood had become a part of her, a place where her soul could find rest. This concludes another section of the novel, moving toward deeper themes of love, reflection, and personal growth. The story will continue to unfold, exploring the relationships between the guests, the inn's history, and the soothing power of the rainy atmosphere. I'll keep expanding the narrative, but let me know if there are specific directions or details you'd like to see. As the weekend at Mosswood drew to a close, the rain had settled into a gentle mist, the kind that clung to the trees and painted the world in soft, muted tones. The inn, as always, remained a place of warmth and refuge, but now it felt as though it had become something more. A quiet sanctuary for the heart, a place where time seemed to slow and the outside world faded into the background. Eleanor stood by the window in her room, looking out at the lake one last time before she packed her things. The mist still hung low over the water, giving the landscape a dreamlike quality. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago she had arrived here, feeling drained and disconnected. Now, as she prepared to leave, she felt something within her had shifted. Mosswood and the stories she had shared with the other guests had given her a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. Downstairs, the guests were beginning to gather in the sitting room for a final cup of tea and some quiet conversation before saying their goodbyes. Daniel was there, of course, his camera in hand, as he captured the last moments of their time together. Clara sat by the fire, her journal open in her lap, scribbling down notes for the novel she had been inspired to start during her stay. Margaret and Joan, ever the pillars of quiet wisdom, were still knitting, their steady hands a calming presence in the room. Eleanor joined them, sitting down in her favorite chair by the window. She had grown close to these people over the course of the weekend, and though they were all strangers when they first arrived, they were leaving as friends, connected by the shared experience of quiet reflection and the rain's gentle song. As they sipped their tea, the conversation turned to the topic of returning. Clara was the first to speak, her eyes bright with excitement. "I'm definitely coming back next year," she said with a grin. "There's something about this place. It sparks something in me. I can't quite explain it, but I know I need more of it." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Same here. There's a stillness here that you just can't find anywhere else. It's like the rain wraps everything up in quiet and makes the world a little softer." Margaret smiled warmly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. "That's the beauty of Mosswood. It's a place where time slows down and you can really listen to yourself. It's why Joan and I keep coming back, year after year. There's a magic here." Eleanor felt the truth of those words deeply. Mosswood had given her space to breathe, to think, to reflect. The rain, which had accompanied her every moment here, had become a kind of companion, a soothing presence that calmed her mind and softened the edges of her thoughts. She would carry the memory of that peace with her when she left, knowing that it would always be waiting for her the next time she returned. The time came, as it always does, to say goodbye. The guests lingered in the sitting room, reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire and the gentle sound of the rain outside. But the world outside beckoned, and they knew they had to return to their lives, taking with them the quiet lessons they had learned during their stay. Mrs. Aldridge appeared with a soft smile, handing out small packages to each of the guests. "Just a little something to remember Mosswood by," she said with a twinkle in her eye. Eleanor opened her package and found a small notebook, its pages blank and ready to be filled with thoughts, reflections, and memories. It was the perfect gift, an invitation to carry the quiet of Mosswood with her, even when she was far away. As the guests gathered their things and prepared to leave, there was a sense of quiet understanding between them. They had shared something special here. A weekend of peace and reflection, of stories told by the fire and walks in the rain. They had come to Mosswood seeking different things, but they were all leaving with a sense of connection, both to the place and to each other. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the mist still clinging to the trees and the lake. Eleanor stood by her car for a moment, breathing in the cool, damp air and listening to the gentle patter of the rain on the leaves. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the time she had spent here, for the friends she had made, and for the peace she had found in the quiet moments. Daniel waved goodbye as he climbed into his own car, his camera safely tucked away, ready to capture the next adventure. Clara hugged Eleanor tightly, promising to keep in touch, and Margaret and Joan offered their gentle goodbyes with the warmth of old friends. As Eleanor started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, she took one last look at Mosswood through the rearview mirror. The inn stood proudly, shrouded in mist, its windows glowing softly with the light of the fire inside. It was a place that felt timeless, as though it had always been there and always would be. A place where people came to find themselves and each other. The road ahead stretched out before her, winding through the misty forest, but Eleanor didn't feel rushed. The rain continued to fall softly, the world outside a gentle blur of green and gray. And as she drove away, she knew that Mosswood and the peace she had found there would stay with her long after the rain had stopped. Weeks passed, and Eleanor found herself back in the rhythm of her life in the city. The noise and busyness that had once overwhelmed her now felt more manageable, tempered by the quiet she had carried with her from Mosswood. She still had moments of stress, moments when the world seemed to move too quickly, but when those moments came, she would close her eyes and listen for the sound of the rain. And in those quiet moments, she could feel Mosswood, its misty lake, its cozy sitting room, its old piano and crackling fire. She could hear the soft voices of the friends she had made, their laughter blending with the sound of the rain on the windows. It was a place that lived in her memory now, a place she could return to whenever she needed it. On particularly rainy days, Eleanor would take out the notebook Mrs. Aldridge had given her and fill its pages with thoughts and memories. She would write about the walks she had taken by the lake, about the love letters she had found in the old study, about the stories she had shared with the other guests by the fire. Each word was a reminder of the peace she had found in that quiet corner of the world, where the rain never seemed to stop, and time moved at its own gentle pace. And so, even in the midst of her busy life, Eleanor carried the rain with her. A reminder that peace was always within reach, that stillness could be found even in the noisiest of places. All she had to do was listen. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey with the Rainy Mosswood Inn. We hope the rain and quiet of Mosswood brought you a sense of calm and relaxation. If you enjoyed your time with us, you may consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more cozy stories to drift off to. Until next time, may your nights be restful and your dreams serene.